Så dagens predikan hålls av Shan, så vi ger en varm applåd upp till scenen.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I'm giving this in English. So I was actually asked to do this last spring, but then Corona struck, which is very good because I hadn't prepared anything then. And I was supposed to give it 2 weeks ago, but then I went to Gothenburg, but that was good because I haven't prepared anything then either. And then it was postponed another week, right? Because I had to keep on working in Gothenburg. But that was good. I hadn't prepared anything either at that point either as well. But now I decided to finally do it. And so this is something I've been thinking about kind of for the past year or so. And to start off, we should ask ourselves, but before we start off, I want to add like a little trigger warning. Like, I feel a bit bad to call this a sermon, because I don't know if I'm speaking the truth, but I think there are some interesting ideas coming out of this. And we start ourselves by asking ourselves the question, are animals religious? This is actually a very difficult question to answer. There are observations of elephants burying their dead. But when did our early ancestors become religious? Modern humans are believed to have emerged 300,000 years ago from Ethiopia. The oldest tomb is about 100,000 years old. So I suggest that somewhere around that time, humans became religious. So now we can ask ourselves also, when did they worship gods? How did they worship gods? What was their God like? And what was the purpose of religion in society? Were they religious? Could we call them religious? Or would we call them secular? Would there be something secular about them? So I posed some very interesting questions, but actually I won't answer any of them very well. I'll just use this as an excuse to introduce the ideas of the French historian, literary critic, philosopher of social science, René Girard. He's actually Christian, but his ideas might come across as very materialistic. But there's a good reason for that. And today I would like to kind of use this as an overview of his ideas. I won't go into too much detail or provide too much justification. And if I take too much, if I go past 20 minutes, you should tell me. So I'll speed this up a bit. But his ideas is to aim to link the origin of religion with the crucifixion of Jesus. And there's a very coherent narrative between those. Furthermore, I will also try to hint how this is also related to the rise of secularism and materialism in the Western world and the globe and globally. But to understand this, we need to, so let's embark on this thought experiment, the Gedanken experiment in German. Yeah, physicists like it a lot. And we need to understand just a couple of things about primitive man. First, primitive man, like 10,000 years ago, was very violent. Wars were common. Prisoners never taken. If they were taken as slaves or eaten. The oldest homicide victim known is a 10-year-old from 29,000 years ago. There are plenty of mass graves, executions of women and children. And it's speculated that the leading cause of death was murder. Second thing we need to understand about primitive man was probably that they experienced the world in a completely different way. So when we look at isolated tribes in the world, the most common form of religion is a form of animism, or totemism, or shamanism. But what's important about these, what they have kind of in common is that the material world is not dead, it's alive, it's sacred, that there's no difference between the inner and outer worlds, like inner in what I think and the outer world as I see it. And there's a very interesting argument made by Owen Barfield, who was a friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. He influenced them both very much, and he was also influenced by them. He was part of this Inklings group. He stated that there's this ancient Greek word pneuma, which appears in the Greek translations of the Bible. It means breath, wind, and spirit in the English language. But for Owen Barfield, pneuma was not a metaphor for breath, wind, and spirit, but actually an expression of the same thing. So for the ancient Greeks, the breath, wind, and spirit were the same. The inner and outer words were indistinguishable. As a consequence, the self-identity, the idea of an I was non-existent or very weak. What was important was the tribe and the clan and the community. So now we can try to understand a little bit of the ideas presented by Girard. So I need to introduce this tool with this idea called mimesis. The concept of mimesis that Girard thinks is very important for ancient societies. He says that there's nothing or next to nothing in human behavior that is not learned, and all learning is based on imitation or mimesis. If human beings ceased imitating, all forms of culture would vanish. So in a society with violent creatures living in a harsh world with little resources, imitation could be lethal. If one individual pursues, let's say, in this trivial case, a banana, everyone will copy its behavior. If there are not enough bananas for all of them to go around, there will be competition. And if the competition persists long enough, it will devolve into a frenzied free-for-all and the destruction and murder of the community. So Girard says that the story of Cain and Abel recounts this dynamic for two people. Both are called to sacrifice to God, yet only Abel's is accepted. Cain becomes angry and downcast. Abel got something, but Cain desired it as well. But the object of desire could not be granted to both. Thus Cain murdered Abel. This is an archetypical example of conflict caused by mimesis, or conflictual mimesis, as Girard calls it. This, of course, places a clear limitation on the size of communities in ancient society. So chimpanzees, for example, forms communities of about 50 individuals, and it's believed that primitive man probably also initially could not exceed a community larger than 50. But they eventually did that. So how do we create stable societies? To understand this, Girard says that we need to take kind of this mimetic conflict into its climax. So what happens is that when everyone starts to desire this banana, the banana itself kind of disappears as an object of desire. And instead what becomes important is the conflict itself. They start fighting each other. But after a while, it can happen that suddenly everyone's attention, which is not focusing on the banana, but on the violence itself, starts to drift towards a single person. And we have to remember that primitive man could not separate between what I feel and the world they see very well. So they felt anger, they felt suffering, they felt hatred. And then they see this individual and associate all of the suffering and anger and hatred on this individual. So how do they solve it? They murder him. So mankind invented lynching. And I can read what Girard says. The community satisfies its rage against an arbitrary victim in the unshakable conviction that it has found the one and only cause of its trouble. It then finds itself without adversaries, purged of all hostility against those of whom a second before it had shown the most extreme rage. And mankind invented lynching, and then the death of this apparent culprit responsible for all the suffering would restore peace to the community. And so the return to a calmer state of affairs appears to confirm the responsibility of the victim for the mimetic discord that had troubled the community. So we can summarize what had happened so far. So basically, the members of the community imitate each other's desires, but the objects of desire are not enough to go around to everyone. So they fight for it. And then this struggle becomes more important than the object itself. And then they solved it by killing a single person who they considered to be responsible for the chaos in the society. This is what Girard calls the victimage mechanism, or also called scapegoating. We will recognize this as scapegoating, right? The victim is said to carry all the sins of the community and then expelled, as in Leviticus. However, in Judeo-Christian culture, as ours, it also has a dual understanding of blaming someone innocent. For primitive man, however, the now dead victim inspired terror, suffering, anger, but also peace and hope as it died. How could someone cause so much suffering, but also restore peace? These feelings evaded understanding. Thus the victim became sacred and eventually a god. The peace and community generated by the collective murder provided primitive societies with a tool to control conflict. By implementing taboos and prohibitions, primitive societies aimed to prevent harmful imitation and competition.
Ja, är det verkligen det du pratar om?
No. Thanks. Primitive man then sought to reenact the original founding murder that brought the community together. At regular intervals, they would find new victims, recreate the discord, and then kill or expel the victim from the community to recreate the original feeling as closely as possible. This is what we identify as ritual. The retelling and justification for the murder would be known as myth. Primitive man worshipped violence as a means to bring peace. So religion is concerned with peace, but violence is a means to bring it about. Girard postulates. And this was the birth of religion, primitive religion. According to Girard, this can also be extended to other cultural institutions. And this also was the birth of civilization. So religion gave birth to civilization, not the opposite. This is very important for Girard. So cultural institutions and social classes were invented to enable ritual sacrifices, to enable religion. It's a child of religion. An example could be, where would our new victims come from? How do we select new victims? An interesting example from Polynesian tribes would be to invent social hierarchies. They're interesting. Anthropologists have made an interesting connection between how socially stratified a society was and the prevalence or the existence of human sacrifice among Polynesian tribes. Of course, in their case, they say that human sacrifice was used to maintain hierarchies, to maintain the aristocracy. But Girard would say it's the opposite, that social hierarchies was created to find a way to select victims. So they would create a caste of people from which the victims were selected from. And the rest of the community would never interact with them unless during the sacrificial period. We will, in case of bananas, a lighter example, but it's still very interesting. So we have two social groups, right? So the conflict arose because there was a single banana, and then they killed someone, and they want to reenact this. So perhaps they could do the following. They could solve it in the following case. They create kind of two castes of people. One group of people who had access to bananas. They grew bananas, they tended bananas, they ate bananas. But the other group of people who were not allowed to have bananas. And then to recreate the ritual, they would select a person from the banana eating community and kill it. But of course, the banana eaters will not necessarily, after a while, they will not be very happy about being selected for sacrifice. And bananas are still desirable because they desire bananas, so everyone else desires bananas. So what they could do is kind of trade for bananas instead with the people who don't have bananas. They could say, instead of you killing us, we could feed the bananas to an animal to kind of represent the access this animal had to bananas. They kill the animal, And in return, the population who does not have access to bananas will then get access to bananas during this short period of time. It's kind of a ritual period. And this would then give rise to a kind of a class of priests who had access to bananas. They would decide when to give out bananas and how it should be done to kind of recreate this original discord, original chaos. However, as time passes, the feeling from the original murder is slowly forgotten because the older generation dies, a new generation is born. We haven't experienced this. And this would also change the rituals. For instance, humans could then be substituted by animal sacrifice instead. An interesting observation comes from Roman traditions. Romans believed human sacrifices belonged to a time when men and gods lived closer together. As that bygone, merry, happy age had passed, human sacrifices were gradually replaced by animal ones. This was a Roman understanding of themselves and their culture. Yet these animals were still considered in Roman myths as being punished for various transgressions, like eating sacred objects, perhaps a banana. The victims were always guilty. The role of sacrifice and violence as a bedrock of civilization was probably intuitively understood in ancient society, at least. We continue to recount the story of Cain and Abel. So after Cain murders Abel, Cain fears for his life. God commands that anyone who murders Cain will die as well, will be avenged. Then follows a detailed genealogy of Cain. So Lamech married two women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. So we see something recognizable as civilization springing from the lineage of Cain. We can also read a similar pattern in the story of Romulus and Remus. After Romulus kills Remus, he builds the city of Rome. Girard claims that our culture, what makes us human, comes from sacrifice and murder. Behind every cultural institution lies a victim. What distinguishes us from animals is how efficiently we have yielded lynching as a tool. However, of course, there's something that rings strange about this. Today, we all recognize this as morally reprehensible. The ancients were not. Why is this the case? First, we need to remember that primitive man's affection for sacrifice of both human and non-human alike relied on the conviction of the victim's guilt. This is tightly connected to the fact that primitive man could not distinguish between the inner and outer world. Their suffering was projected onto the victim. Every sacrifice, every ritual is an affirmation that man lives in the world and the world lives in man, that matter is alive. Girard explains simply what changed ancient man, Jesus. Oops. The crucifixion of Jesus follows the archetypical pattern of scapegoating or ritualistic sacrifice. Yet what makes the story of Jesus unique is that it takes the victim's perspective, which no one has ever dared to ask before. Myth almost always sides with the survivors and the mob. That is why ancient gods are violent and seem very human. If they break prohibitions, they're rightfully punished. Revenge and justice are common themes. There are no innocent gods. They all have blood on their hands. However, the story told in the Gospels clearly shows an innocent man murdered by other men. Jesus is first mocked as king, crucified as slave, for the world to watch, mocked and paraded among the crowds. This pattern is found among rituals in other ancient religions, yet the victim's perspective is never told. There are, for instance, interesting recounts of the sacred kings in ancient tribes where they select a king and then they murder him. So in that case, it means that the king for a day gets to have access to all the wealth the community can provide. He can have access to all the women and all the food for a day, but then he's executed. It's also an interesting account, which I can't find the source of. They actually did this in Rome. So when the Romans crowned Jesus, they actually knew what they were doing. They had done this before. It was a story of a prisoner who for a day was crowned king and was allowed to enter all the brothels in Rome. But then the next day they executed him. So he knew very well what they were doing. Now, before we go to that, a Christian could therefore no longer see a sacrificial ritual without asking themselves, is the victim really guilty? Who could worship a God that demanded blood? For in every victim, Christians saw a potential Jesus. However, other consequences developed as well. The rejection of sacrifice, the insistence of innocence, and the sympathy for victims started to open a chasm between the inner and outer world. The suffering I feel is not necessarily caused by my neighbor or the person I see. For Christians, the pagani of the world perform rituals with obscene demonstrations of violence and power. Their religio was regarded as superstitio. Christianity, however, could de-sacralize the rituals in the world through the lens of the crucifixion. This is a radical shift in Western thought that cannot be understated. So when Constantine made Christianity a straight state religion, one of the first things they did was to ban blood sacrifices. Of course, this was not very popular among the Roman elite. The split between the sacred and the profane, between the divine, spiritual, and temporal and material, reached an important milestone in 410. As Rome was sacked by the Visigoths, pagan intellectuals and philosophers accused Christianity of failing Rome, of not sacrificing correctly. Typically, times of great distress would be a call to sacrifice, of performing the proper religio. Augustine of Hippo argued that Rome was not the Imperium Christianum, for Christianity pursues the city of God and had therefore not failed Rome and was therefore not responsible for its destruction. There, instead of victory, is truth. Instead of high rank, holiness. Instead of peace, felicity. Instead of life, eternity. The city of God spanned time and space. It was eternal and never changing. This contrasted to the other city, its sibling, which is temporal, ever-changing, and ruled by mortal emperors and generals. This city was a necessary path every Christian had to travel on the way to the city of God. It was a path of suffering and of violence. This city was called the Saeculum, and the Saeculum concerns itself with the secularia, things of the secular. The seeds of secularism were sown. The division of the inner religio and outer Saeculum proceeded and was ever widening following the Reformation. The fall of Rome was not necessarily of divine origin, and the cause of your suffering was not necessarily due to your neighbor. Matter is not sacred, but dead. In the West, we have been so immersed in the assumption that there's a universal idea of the secular and the material that we no longer recognize it as uniquely Christian. As Tom Holland quotes the Indian historian S.N. Balagandhara, Christianity spreads in two ways, through conversion and through secularization. And the philosopher Slavoj Žižek agrees that Christianity brought about the demystification and desacralization of the world. Only through the Christian experience can you reach the abyss of what I call atheism. And I highly recommend actually the book by Tom Holland, Dominion. It's an amazing book of how like all of our Western assumptions are Christian. And it's an interesting idea, and it's interesting a challenge to Christianity itself. Because the basic premise of Christianity is its universality. That everyone are created in the image of God, right? That's a universal idea. This does not necessarily exist in other cultures, never did not exist before. And yeah, so I highly recommend the book. It's really good. Read it. Tegnell. I need to Tegnell. However, we're not near the end of religious evolution and consciousness. In a Western society that likes to perceive itself as more and more secular, by becoming less and less Christian, which ironically is not really the case. They're actually becoming more and more Protestant by becoming more and more secular. What we might find instead is that we are becoming more and more pagan as a replacement. Owen Barfield attempts to diagnose the problem of separating the inner and outer worlds. And I'll read the whole quote since I guess I have some time. Amid all the menacing signs that surround us in the middle of the 20th century, perhaps the one that fills thoughtful people with the greatest foreboding is a growing general sense of meaninglessness. It is this which underlies most of the other threats. How is it that the more able man becomes in manipulating the world to his advantage, the less he can perceive any meaning in it? By combating the meaninglessness, will we turn to Christianity or will we turn to paganism? As T.S. Eliot argued, that the future of the West will be determined by a contest between Christianity and modern paganism. If we don't tread carefully, however, Girard argues we could end up reinventing ritual sacrifice by practicing scapegoating. However, this time it will not have the same effect. It will not restore peace to a community. Because everyone would not be able to agree that the chosen victim is guilty, because modern man sympathizes with victims too much, and the murder of a victim will never bring peace. I would just like to end with kind of this idea that the fact that we like victims so much everywhere in the world, even communists in the end, right? They kind of feel sympathy for the working class, the poor, the helpless, is a deeply Christian idea. The fact that they reject Christianity is just an extreme form of Protestantism. In the end. And I think through the ideas of René Girard and through the book written by Tom Holland called Dominion, we can kind of see how this traces throughout human history. So I hope that was kind of it. It was actually a lot shorter than I thought, but that's good. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Tack så mycket, Shan. Det är nice att höra en ny röst, nya perspektiv.